The committee will come to order. Because the secretary must leave at 4 o'clock, after opening remarks, I will ask the secretary to summarize her testimony, and then we will move directly to the questions from our members. Given the vote situation, the ranking member will be recognized to deliver his opening remarks if we are going to be interrupted by votes, but here you are, and there's no problem. So I'm going to give my remarks and then yours, because you were going to be...
You're going to give my remarks?
No, I will give mine. I don't trust you with my remarks. But without objection, members may have 5 days to submit statements and questions for the record. Madam Secretary, welcome back to the committee to discuss the administration's foreign relations budget request. All of us have great respect for you, Madam Secretary, as well as for the dedicated men and women who promote the interests and values of our nation throughout the world. Our nation faces unsustainable deficits, so we must justify every dollar that we spend, especially because 35 cents of every dollar is borrowed. I appreciate your restraint with the top-line number in your budget proposal, coming in at $5.1 billion below last year's request. But I disagree with the priorities and programs funded with those limited resources. In Iraq and Afghanistan, both these governments must be pushed to take the necessary steps to be our long-term, reliable partners. We are not seeing such a commitment from Karzai or Maliki. Too much American blood and treasure have been invested in both countries for us to have governments in place that threaten American interest. Iran's belligerent and unhelpful role in Afghanistan and Iraq is worrisome, particularly with reports indicating their co-option of those governments at senior levels. So, Madam Secretary, what additional pressure can we bring to bear to offset the Iranian influence in Afghanistan and Iraq? In Pakistan, the level of cooperation, as we know, that we get from the government continues to fall short. Serious questions persist about whether elements of the Pakistani government support prominent insurgent groups fighting against our troops in Afghanistan. In other Middle Eastern countries, I've had concerns from day one about the administration's approach to the Arab Spring and to the forces at work there, including radical Islamist groups. The administration appears focused on spending a lot of money in search of a policy. Your budget request doubles down on that approach by requesting a $770 million Middle East and North Africa incentive fund, a fund with almost no restriction on how it can be used. Even though press reports indicate that Egypt may have decided to lift the travel ban on our NGO workers, we should not reward Egypt with aid when it is demonstrating hostility to Western democratic entities and is engaging in an ongoing dance between authoritarians and the Muslim Brotherhood. In contrast, the administration did the right thing by enforcing U.S. law and cutting off funding to UNESCO after it undermined peace by admitting the non-existent state of Palestine. Your request to now change the law and send $80 million to UNESCO would be a grave mistake. Any weakening of U.S. law would undermine our credibility and give a green light for other UN agencies to grant recognition of a Palestinian state. U.S. funding for UNESCO must only be restored if UNESCO votes to unadmit Palestine. The budget for the Western Hemisphere, which is not mentioned in the prepared testimony, is another example of misplaced priorities. The administration has requested an increase in funding for the general budget of the Organization of American States, yet you cut U.S. contributions to the OAS Fund for Strengthening Democracy by almost $2 million. The administration is proposing increased financial assistance to Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador, three governments that continue to undermine U.S. security interests in the hemisphere, disregard human rights, and ignore the rule of law. There can be no justification for such an increase in funds to these countries. In Nicaragua, state has spent millions to promote free, fair, and transparent elections. That money was not used wisely, as the elections in Nicaragua were fraudulent and ran afoul of the Nicaraguan Constitution. We must not repeat last year's performance in Ecuador or Bolivia, where State Departments spent more money on environmental programs than counter-narcotics operations or good governance. This budget fails to hold abusers of democracy in the region accountable and cuts support for democracy. Instead of standing in solidarity with the Cuban and Venezuelan people in their time of need, this budget turns its back on them. Repression continues unabated in Cuba. The Castro regime orders its state security forces to beat members of the Ladies in White, Las Damas de Blanco, as they leave church services on Sundays. Prisoners of conscience die, while many worldwide turn a blind eye to their plight. In Venezuela, the Chavez regime has demolished the authority of the National Assembly and intimidated the opposition by leveraging control over the judicial system. Turning to the disastrous situation in Syria, this administration does not appear to have a coherent strategy. The Russians and the Iranians clearly have a strategy, and it could be summarized as actively support the repression by the Syrian army. The Iranian regime defies responsible nations and pursues nuclear weapons capabilities. A nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and we must oppose any policy that relies on mere containment as a response to this mortal threat. President Obama has said that the United States has an ironclad commitment to the security of Israel. So will the U.S. militarily back Israel if it decides to protect itself from an Iranian nuclear threat? Finally, Madam Secretary, I have grave concerns about today's North Korea announcement, which sounds a lot like the failed agreements of the past. While it is good that it mentions the uranium enrichment program, whose existence the North Koreans had so long denied, we must recall that regime's constant duplicity. We have bought this bridge several times before. One troubling new aspect is the discussion of nuclear issues and food aid in the same announcement, which blurs the separation of humanitarian aid from the nuclear negotiations, which has been maintained since 1995. The North Koreans will view this food as payment due for their return to the bargaining table, regardless of the transparency and monitoring we hope to secure in the future. Again, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for making yourself available today. I look forward, and the members do as well, to receiving your testimony. And now I'm pleased to recognize my friend, the gentleman from California, the ranking member, Mr. Berman, for his opening statements.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And Madam Secretary, welcome. Thanks for being here. At the outset, there's some differences in our view. I'd like to commend you for your hard work on North Korea. Today's announcement that Pyongyang has agreed to freeze long-range missile launches, nuclear tests, and uranium enrichment activities and allow the IAEA back into the country appears to be an important step on a long and difficult path. You know, the Chair knows, I know, we all know that we've been down this road before, and it does remain to be seen whether the North will keep its promises this time. But in a more general sense, I'd like to recognize the tremendous commitment and dedication you have shown to reestablishing the United States, not just as an indispensable power, but as an indispensable partner. You have made it your mission to show the world the best of who we are as Americans. Eloquently and consistently, you have spoken up for women, for the poor, and for those whose human rights and dignity had been trampled. You have elevated development alongside diplomacy and defense as a pillar of our national security. Within the administration and in the halls of Congress, you have fought to ensure that our diplomats and aid workers receive the resources they need and the respect they deserve. They risk their lives every day to support American interests abroad. And in the face of mounting deficits here at home, it is important to remember that these civilian efforts are much more cost-effective than deploying our military. Today, we're here to assess how the President's fiscal year 2013 international affairs budget responds to the threats and priorities we face as a nation. Many people believe erroneously that foreign aid accounts for 20% or more of our budget. The truth is we spend just over 1% of our national budget on diplomacy and development, yet these programs have an outsized impact on our health, prosperity, and security here at home. With 1 in 5 American jobs dependent on trade, half our exports going to developing countries, our overseas programs are a critical part of strengthening the American economy and getting America back to work. Our security is threatened if nuclear weapons fall into the wrong hands or if fragile and failing states become training grounds for terrorists. Our foreign assistance dollars help counter the flow of illicit narcotics and control the spread of organized crime. Nearly a quarter of 2013 fiscal year international affairs budget request is dedicated to supporting critical U.S. efforts in the frontline states of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And finally, the principles we cherish are undermined if we allow families to go hungry, children to die of easily preventable diseases, and girls to be kept out of school. In short, helping countries become more democratic, more stable, more capable of defending themselves, and better at pulling themselves out of poverty is just as important for us and our national security as it is for them. To succeed, we must ensure that our budget resources are allocated wisely, our international programs are carried out in the most efficient and effective manner. But before closing, I'd like to highlight two of my top and somewhat interrelated priorities: Middle East peace and the effort to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability. Madam Secretary, for the past 3 years, the Palestinians have simply refused to engage seriously in peace talks. My sad conclusion is that Palestinian leaders don't have the will or the desire to make the compromises necessary to achieve peace. They don't want to engage seriously because they know that in the end, they won't be able to do the deal. That's what happened at Camp David in 2000, at Taba in 2001, and in the Omer talks in 2008. And now, nearly 2 decades after Oslo, I see no evidence that the Palestinians have begun in the slightest to prepare their public for the prospect that they will have to relinquish the so-called right of return and recognize Israel as a Jewish state, two critical elements of any peace deal. I find that disturbing. Meanwhile, the Israelis continue to say they'll negotiate any time, any place. If Palestinian leaders really want statehood, they'll have to show it both through their public commitments and by engaging in serious negotiations with Israel. If they try to circumvent negotiations by once again taking their case to the United Nations, they'll get no recognition from the United States, and they won't get the time of day from the U.S. Congress. The only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that can bring peace and security to both parties is a two-state solution, and that only can become a reality through direct negotiations. Let me turn to another issue, what I consider the greatest security challenge facing both Israel and the United States, namely the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. I believe it was during your first testimony before this committee in 2009 that you first said that our goal was to impose crippling sanctions on Iran if the regime doesn't suspend its uranium enrichment program and otherwise comply with the demands of the UN Security Council. Now the sanctions are finally starting to have some bite, and within a few weeks or so, the Congress is likely to pass new legislation for the President to sign, legislation that tightens sanctions and that gives the administration new authorities to tighten sanctions still further. The House passed its version of that legislation, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, by an overwhelming vote late last year. Can you give us a status report on the impact of sanctions in Iran and on whether there is any sign that they are starting to have the desired effect on the thinking of Iranian decision makers? Thank you, Madam Secretary. I look forward to hearing your testimony.
I thank the ranking member. It is the chair's intention to continue the hearing during votes. And now it is an honor to welcome the secretary to our committee today. The Honorable Hillary Rodham Clinton has served as the 67th Secretary of State for the United States since January 21, 2009, the latest chapter in her 4-decade career of public service. She has served previously as a United States Senator from the state of New York, as First Lady of the United States and of the state of Arkansas, as an attorney and a law professor. Madam Secretary, without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record. If you would be so kind as to summarize your written remarks, we can then move quickly to the question and answer discussion under the 5-minute rule and the hope to getting to all of our members before you have to depart. So, Madam Secretary, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member, and it is very good to be back here. I'm grateful to your committee and the members for the support and consultation that we've enjoyed over these past 3 years. I look forward to your questions. I will submit my entire statement to the record and look forward to having a chance to exchange views with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So we can get right to the question and answer, Madam Secretary? Delish. Thank you so much. So the chair recognizes herself for her questions. Madam Secretary, I've heard from a number of my constituents. As you know, I represent South Florida, the gateway to the Americas, who are worried that ALBA countries, led by Chavez, continue to pressure to invite Cuba to the summit of the Americas in April, even though the Castro dictatorship does not meet the criteria to join the meeting, as you know. Will you pledge here today that if Cuba is invited, that President Obama and you, Madam Secretary, will refuse to attend the summit meeting? And secondly, and I'll ask it all at once so you can answer, Madam Secretary, on Iran in the Western Hemisphere. Just last month, Ahmadinejad's tour of tyrants, as I called it, his trip to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Ecuador, reaffirmed Iran's commitment to undermine U.S. national security interests. I'm concerned about Iran's willingness to attack the United States homeland or our critical allies, such as Israel. With the rising threat posed by the Quds Force and its Iranian proxies, such as Hezbollah, in our region, will we dedicate more attention to these illicit activities in the annual terrorism report? And lastly, what is the administration doing to ensure cooperation from our allies in the hemisphere with respect to Iran and to hold accountable those countries that are supporting and enabling Iran's threatening activities? Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much. With respect to the question about the Summit of Americas, we do not believe there is any intention to invite Cuba. We've made our views on that well known. They don't fit the definition of the democratic countries and the development of democracy in the hemisphere. So at this point, we see absolutely no basis and no intention to invite them to the summit. Regarding Iran and the Western Hemisphere, you know, obviously Iran facing these very effective sanctions and their aggressive enforcement is becoming increasingly desperate, looking for friends wherever they think they can find them. And they're not getting the kind of response on that tour of tyrants that you referenced. Our analysis of what happened is that it fell very far short of what the Iranians had hoped for. That said, we are concerned about the activities of Iran and Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere. We continue to monitor the situation closely. We will take appropriate action to counter any threat that may arise. We are aware of and concerned about allegations that some Latin American drug trafficking organizations are linked with Hezbollah and Iran. We've not found information to verify a lot of the allegations, but of course the recent incident concerning the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador is a very large question mark and wake-up call. We are continuing to look for direct links, and we are engaged very extensively with our partners in the hemisphere, both to educate them about the dangers posed by Iran and Hezbollah, and also to work with them to heighten our intelligence sharing. Now, we did impose sanctions in 2008 and extended them last year on the Venezuelan Military Industries Company for violating a ban on technology that could assist Iran in developing weapons. So if we find information that we can verify, we are committed to taking action. But what we instead are seeing, much to our encouragement, is that our partners in Latin America are really understanding the threats. Recently at the IAEA, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile joined us in voting for a resolution calling on Iran to address concerns about the nuclear program. Last year, Chile, Mexico, and Brazil voted to create the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Iran. And our close coordination with Mexican authorities actually was instrumental in breaking up the assassination plot against the Saudi ambassador. So I think, Madam Chairman, we are alert to this. We are watching it closely. We are building a very strong international and hemispheric coalition against any efforts by Iran and Hezbollah in our area.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Berman.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman and Madam Secretary. The Obama administration is the first administration to use congressionally mandated sanctions on Iran in a robust way, and you deserve considerable praise for that. I know that the President and you and numerous officials at State, at Treasury, at Defense have put in literally thousands of hours trying to persuade foreign officials and foreign businessmen to respect our sanctions and to help isolate Iran, all for the purpose of implementing a policy intended to lead Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons program. In that regard, I think it would be helpful to put to rest concerns of some observers that the administration is resigned to Iran's becoming a nuclear threshold state. I think it's important to very important to reassure us on that point. Based on my understanding of the administration's policy, I think you should be able to do that. 3 months ago, on December 1st, Secretary of State Burns and Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister Ileana issued a joint statement that spoke of, and I quote, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability, end of quote. And a Pentagon publication last month also said that U.S. seeks to, quote, prevent Iran's development of a nuclear weapons capability, close quote. So when Senator Graham yesterday asked whether the administration seeks to deny Iran the ability to become a nuclear threshold state, you responded by saying that it is the position of the administration to prevent them, meaning the Iranians, from attaining nuclear weapons. So I think it's important to clarify, is in fact administration policy to prevent Iran's development of a nuclear weapons capability, or is the policy merely to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons? And what's the real difference between these two? Does the administration have a red line beyond which it will not allow Iran's nuclear program to progress? Can we feel assured that it's the administration's policy to make sure Iran remains well short of the ability to produce nuclear arms?
Well, Congressman, I think it's absolutely clear that the President's policy is to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons capability. And that has been the stated position of this administration. It has been backed up and reiterated, so that let there be no confusion in any shorthand answer to any question. The policy remains the same. And certainly in pursuance of that policy, we have worked closely with the Congress to implement the most far-reaching sanctions that have ever been imposed. And after 3 years of intensive diplomatic effort, we have developed an international coalition that recognizes the importance of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons capability that is working with us. 3 years ago, we didn't have that consensus in the international community. There was a lot of unwillingness and resistance even to going along with tougher sanctions. But from the beginning, we've had a two-track policy, pressure and engagement. And as we talk today, the pressure is ratcheting up. We are aggressively working to implement the sanctions. We have very strong support for this position from the recent report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, pointing out all of the suspicions and questions about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And we have seen finally a response from Iran that they're willing to discuss their nuclear weapons program with the P5+1. So we think that the sanctions are affecting the thinking of the Iranians in the leadership, but we have to remain vigilant. We have to keep the pressure on.
Well, thank you very much. I think I could get a question and answer in 44 seconds.
Or you could yield back and give other members more time, as I did.
All right. Well, that appeal to...
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And being the wise legislator that he is, Dr. Paul elected to stay here, and so he gets to ask his question.
Well, that's
Congressman Paul of
wonderful.
Texas is
Thank
recognized.
you.
I've learned not to say anything negative about Ron Paul.
Welcome, Madam Secretary. I do want to get your comments a little bit about the stir that was caused by the apology over the Quran. And the administration has received a lot of criticism about this, and I think you've expressed some a point that maybe this doesn't help your job any by stirring up the resentment. But, excuse me, but the whole issue of an apology, I think, is an interesting one from a national level. And I recall what happened after McNamara wrote his memoirs, and he was apologetic about what happened and why he orchestrated the Vietnam War. And a reporter asked him if he should apologize, and he says, what good's an apology? He says, if the policies are wrong, he says, you have to learn something from it and change the policy. So a lot of emotions come out on this issue of apology. And I keep thinking that, those who did to criticize him, I don't think they criticized the last administration when the president apologized for using the Quran as a target. So sometimes apologies aren't always all equal. But even that said, there were torture photographs before. They were very aggravating. Recently, there was urinating on bodies, on corpses. We didn't particularly apologize for those, did we? I mean, there weren't apologies there. But some of these things are emotional. But what about the whole idea of invading a country and occupying a country and disturbing their country, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees and suffering? Does it ever get to a point where apologizing about the Quran is rather minor to some of the other problems that we have created in these countries? And could you comment on that?
Well, Congressman, first, I appreciate the very measured comments you've made about our presidents, not only this one, but prior presidents, offering apologies when we are deeply sorry for unfortunate incidents that occur that were not intentional and which we know have emotional resonance with people. The larger question you ask, I think it's also important to put into context. President Obama promised to wind down the Iraq War. He has done so. He's in the process of transitioning out of Afghanistan in a manner that is done appropriately in keeping with the very large decisions that have to be made about helping the Afghans defend themselves, working with our partners and allies in that effort. And I think the underlying premise is certainly one that can be debated among Americans of good faith. You know, I believe that we were justified in going to Afghanistan, which is the
I want to apologize because I don't want to get on that subject.
And I accept your apology.
Okay.
Thank
yeah,
you,
there
sir.
You go. But I do want to touch on something else to get a little different perspective on the nuclear enrichment in Iran, because we hear different stories. Even in Israel, there are debates. Tamir Pardo actually said, if they get a weapon, it's not an existential threat, to Israel. So I'm sure there's probably a more nuanced debate in Israel than there is here sometime. But isn't it true that Iran has the right to enrich up to 20% for peaceful purposes? Most people, the way we talk and you hear the discussion, they have absolutely no right to enrich. Don't they have that protection under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, Non-Proliferation Treaty? But it never seems to have a balanced approach to that. And the best I can tell from what I read, there's no evidence that they have a bomb. There's no evidence that they're on the verge of getting it. And even the administration, whether it's Panetta or Clapper or General Dempsey, they're saying it wouldn't make any sense to have a preemptive attack on there. Could you give us a sense of a proper balance here? Because a lot of people are convinced it's Syria and then it's Iran, and I'm personally concerned about that because the last thing the American people need is another war. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources, and the military is not ready for another war.
9 seconds.
Congressman, I would direct your attention to the most recent Director General's report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, not an American document, which outlines the concerns about the non-peaceful use of civilian nuclear power. There is increasing evidence that what the Iranians do is not consistent with your right, their right to have the peaceful use of nuclear power. And I'll be happy to get you a copy of that because I think you ask a very important set of questions.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Ackerman, the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Middle East and South Asia.
Thank you. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Always great to have you here. It's exceptional to me that sometimes you can't win for winning, and even with the unprecedented victories that you and the administration have had in the foreign policy area, some people continue to look at it. I guess I would call it the Goldilocks game with the three bears. The porridge is always too hot, or the porridge is always too cold. I think you got it just right. I think instead of Goldilocks, you're more like the guy on the Ed Sullivan Show, who used to be up there with the 12 bowling pins, juggling them all at the same time, bouncing basketballs up and down over his knees, and has these sticks with the plates on top that he's twirling in the air, and nothing ever falls to the ground. And it's more difficult because you're really twirling somebody else's dirty dishes. But nonetheless, you seem to have everything pretty much together. I don't want to jinx it. With all of the unprecedented problems in the world that we're facing all at the same time. And I just want to thank you and congratulate you and the administration. Three areas: North Korea, Egypt, and Iran, hotspots. First on Egypt, congratulations, the announcement that we just received within the hour that the flight restrictions on the Americans has been lifted. I think that's miraculous. I know the great effort and work that you have put into this, both behind the scenes as well as publicly, and how delicate this negotiation has been. Does this indicate to us some sense of where the power shifting and shuffling in Egypt is going and who is exercising it, at least at this very sensitive moment, or don't we want to speculate on that?
Well, Congressman, we do not have confirmation that the travel ban has been lifted. We hope that it will be, and we will continue to work toward that. You know, the reporting is encouraging, but we have no confirmation.
Yeah, we always get stuff from the AP first, also, before we before we hear that. North Korea, congratulations on that as well. I know there is never any nexus between humanitarian aid and shifting policies, but congratulations on the great coincidence of the 240 metric tons of humanitarian aid, and it's happening coincidentally at the same time that the North Koreans have at least apparently agreed to a lot more transparency than they've had before in cessation of their nuclear program. Were other countries parties or observers at this bilateral discussion that we had with the North Koreans? Were the Russians or the Chinese or the South Koreans play any role, or was that just us?
Well, the meeting was held in Beijing. The Japanese and South Koreans were intimately involved in the back and forth of the negotiations. We also kept all of them informed, but no one else was a direct participant besides the United States and North Korea.
In reading all the reports of that, it says that they will allow inspection at Yangpyeong. Do we have access to other sites? Or just that main site? Or isn't that clear yet?
That's not clear yet. I mean, that was our principal objective, and we obviously have to continue building on what was achieved.
Like some others that you deal with, you know more than others that they're masters at the shell game. And lastly, Iran. Congratulations on the biting effect that the sanctions are finally grabbing them and taking effect to a tremendous extent. There seems to be a lot of indication that some of our allies, one in particular in the Middle East, is very concerned and interested in us laying down markers rather than saying all options are on the table. And I suppose that's going to get more play in coming days. What are the red lines that the Iranians cannot cross? Are we going to make that public, or are we going to continue to do quiet negotiations on that?
I think it's probably smarter for us to be pressing on the sanctions and the negotiations while we keep our objective of no nuclear capability absolutely clear, instead of setting other benchmarks at this time publicly.
I want to thank you for not concentrating on strutting your stuff and delivering on the steak and not worrying about the sizzle. Thank you.
Thank you. My colleague from Florida, Mr. Rivera, a wise man, staying around.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I learned from the best from you. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for being here today. As you know, recently we marked the 14th anniversary of the February 24th, 1996 shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue airplanes, in which, as you know, 4 Americans were murdered over international airspace by the Castro dictatorship. Subsequent to those murders, the U.S. Congress and then President Clinton passed and signed into law the Helms-Burton Bill, which has never been fully implemented, as you well know, because of a provision which allows a waiver or a suspension every 6 months to that law for implementation of that law. And that suspension, I believe, takes place around every January or February and at mid-year as well. So we probably have just recently seen the Obama administration suspend the Helms-Burton law, as it has been done twice a year, every year since 1996. Now, the rationale allowed in the Helms-Burton law for suspending implementation of the law is twofold. Number one, that it serves U.S. interests, and number two, that it would expedite a transition to democracy in Cuba. Given what we've seen in the last few years during the Obama administration of what has been occurring in Cuba in terms of the wave of repression against human rights activists and dissidents, given the deaths of several hunger strikers, given the recent persecution against the ladies in white, peaceful activists in Cuba that have been calling for democratic reform, given the stern rebuff that former Secretary Richardson received in Cuba to his recent overtures or negotiations, can you tell us, just in the last few years of the Obama administration, that the Helms-Burton law has been suspended, how has that expedited a transition to democracy in Cuba?
Well, Congressman, we take a backseat to no one in our condemnation of the denial of human rights that is a continuing feature of the Castro regime, and the particular instances that you mentioned are ones of great concern to us. We do think that increasing people-to-people contact, supporting civil society in Cuba, enhancing the free flow of information, promoting the capacity for more independence economically and politically from the Cuban authorities is in the interest of the Cuban people and is in the interest of the United States.
And we may agree to disagree on that, but I'm just wondering if there's any evidence of results as a result of that policy that the Obama administration has been pursuing. Do we have any evidence at all of any inkling of democratic reform or a movement towards democracy? Is there anything positive that has resulted from the Obama administration policy toward Cuba that we have evidence, tangible evidence?
Well, in the last 3 years, there have been considerable changes in Cuba's economic policies, which we see as a very positive development. We think having the Cuban people given more economic rights to be able to open businesses, to have more opportunity to pursue their own economic futures goes hand in hand with the promotion of democracy. I wouldn't claim that our movements were a direct cause, but they were coincident with. And very often in oppressive regimes like Cuba, economic freedom precedes political freedom.
Well, then you would agree that if there has been economic freedom, and I dispute that, I don't believe there has been any real economic reforms, genuine economic reforms in Cuba, but if you would agree that if there have been, and we can disagree on that, there certainly have been no political reforms or movement toward democracy,
well,
notwithstanding the economic movement.
Well, despite our very strong objection to the treatment of Alan Gross, the in our view, totally unjustified charge and detention, a great number of political prisoners have been released. And, again, that in and of itself is not final evidence of anything, but the fact that so many political prisoners were released in the last 3 years is, in our view,
Are you aware that those
positive,
those releases were followed by were required by expulsions from the country? You're aware of that? They weren't released into the country.
Well,
they were expelled from the country.
I am aware of that, Congressman, and as I look out over the world and take a historic perspective, I see sometimes that political prisoners are released and expelled where they continue to pursue their democracy work and their advocacy on behalf of human rights from outside the country. So I think the fact is, letting political prisoners go is a very positive development. I wish that they were inside Cuba, continuing to, agitate and advocate for, freedom and democracy. But, their voices are still being heard, especially in the new communications environment in which bloggers and others exist. So
well, I hope
Thank
we'll
you.
I hope
Thank
we'll
you, Mr.
continue to hear
Rivera.
those voices.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Falama-Vega.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Madam Secretary. I have a couple of written questions I want to submit for your consideration. Madam Secretary, this may be one of the last times together, and so I want to publicly thank you for reestablishing America's influence abroad, especially towards the Asia-Pacific region. As you aptly stated, and I quote, "The future of politics will be decided in Asia, not in Afghanistan or Iraq. And the United States will be right at the center of the action." Thanks to your efforts, Madam Secretary, I believe the United States will be front and center. And so I thank you for bucking tradition for your first trip overseas. On your first trip overseas, you visited Asia to convey a strong message that America's relationship across the Asia-Pacific region are indispensable. And in your many trips since then, from Vietnam to Cambodia to Myanmar to China to South Korea to Japan and beyond, you have been about the business of making and keeping economic and strategic commitments that will pay dividends many times over. I applaud you for recognizing the importance of Pacific Island nations in this multifaceted undertaking. And in the context of this hearing to the Foreign Relations Budget hearing, I reiterate what you have stated, and I quote, "Those who say that we can no longer afford to engage with the world have it exactly backward. We cannot afford not to. From opening new markets for American businesses to curbing nuclear proliferation to keep the sea lanes free from commerce and navigation, our work abroad holds the key to our prosperity and security at home," end of quote. I want to also note for the record, Madam Secretary, that when American Samoa and the independent state of Samoa were hit by the most powerful earthquake in 2009, which set off 30-foot waves of a tsunami, which have, to this day, not fully recovered, and yet your office were among the first to stand with us. You fought to make sure that relief supplies and airlifted to us, and your tireless efforts for and on behalf of those who did not go unnoticed. And I thank personally Assistant Secretary Dave Adams for his help in this regard. At my request, Madam Secretary, you personally made it a point to visit my little district. And on behalf of the thousands of our Samoan men and women who proudly serve in the armed forces of our country, we are grateful for your recognition of their services. My people, thank you for remembering us amid the many things you have done for our nation. Madam Secretary, it has been an honor to serve with you, and I commend you for the initiatives you've taken outlined in this budget submission for the East Asia and the Pacific region. I'm glad I still have a couple of seconds to ask you a couple of questions. Madam Secretary, can you reiterate again for the record our fundamental policy of engagement with the People's Republic of China, especially in reference to the crisis we're faced with at the South China Seas?
Well, first, thank you for those very kind comments, but it's a great honor to represent the people of your district and to reach out to the South Pacific region on behalf of our government. We are working to further a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive relationship with China. We think that is in the interest of the American people, both economically and strategically. We have welcomed the peaceful rise of China, and we expect as China continues to develop that it will assume more responsibilities globally. With respect to the South China Sea, it has been our position that although we do not take any stand on the rights attached to any territorial claim, we strongly support the peaceful resolution of such claims in accordance with international law. That has been the position we have taken at ASEAN, at the East Asia Summit, because it's not only about the South China Sea, which is, as you know so well, a very important part of the world's oceans through which more than 40% of the world's trade passes, but it's also about how we resolve disputes concerning territories in or near bodies of water, whether it's the Arctic or the South China Sea. So it's very important we stand for the rule of law and we stand for the peaceful resolution of any disputes, and we've made that known to our friends in the region as well as to China.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Falama-Vega. And Madam Secretary, lacking other members, Mr. Berman and I have agreed to share our 5 minutes with you, if that would be all right.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask about the Keystone Pipeline, so start the clock.
I withdraw mine.
As gas prices continue to soar, Madam Secretary, burdening the American people in this time of economic hardship, we must continue to examine avenues to depend less on foreign oil from rogue regimes. In October of 2010, you mentioned that you were, quote, inclined, end quote, to sign off on the Keystone project because the U.S. will either be, quote, dependent on dirty oil from the Gulf or dirty oil from Canada, end quote. What was it about the pipeline that led you to change your previous assertion? And can you please explain why an additional stable source of oil from a democratic ally such as Canada does not deserve a national interest determination from the Department of State? And Mr. Berman, if you would like to ask your question.
A very specific question about Syria. The security of the chemical and possibly biological weapons in Syria should the Assad regime fall. How real is the danger of these horrific weapons and substances leaving Syria and falling into the hands of terrorists and terrorist groups? And what about a Nunn-Lugar type program to secure, dismantle, and remove chemical and biological weapons and technology from Syria?
Well, first, with respect to Keystone, what I said in 2010 was that energy security considerations exist and needed to be taken into account, but that it had to be part of what is the legal and regulatory requirements for evaluating any pipeline application that crosses an international boundary. The State Department was in the process of making such a determination, and when it became necessary to make a decision, we did not recommend that the President say no. but rather that the presidential permit for the project at that time be denied. And with respect to the national interest, what we were working on was a resolution of the very strong concerns expressed by one of the states through which the pipeline would move, a state that at that time did not have its own process and needed to pass legislation, figure out what the alternative route would be, and then, of course, it fell upon the State Department to evaluate the alternative route. That had not yet been established when we were required to make our decision. Therefore, it was impossible to assess the impact of that new route that had been requested. Now, just in the last 2 days, TransCanada has made a move through a letter indicating their intent to submit a new application which crosses the U.S.-Canada border. At the same time, they're moving forward with parts of the pipeline, like from Oklahoma to Texas, that don't cross the border and don't need State Department evaluation or decision. So I think we've handled this, Madam Chairman, in a way that was commensurate with the law and the regulations. I strongly believe we have to increase our energy security. I strongly support the creation of our new Energy Bureau. Just last week, we signed an important agreement with Mexico to encourage transboundary exploration in the Gulf of Mexico, something that was legally in limbo. So we are committed to doing all that we can to help Americans get the energy supplies we need.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And now to Syria from Ken.
Yes, now on to Syria. Well, you know, we are concerned. I think that it is an issue that deserves the attention of the international community. Nunn-Lugar, of course, was in a permissive environment. It was after the Soviet Union had fallen, the new Russian Federation came into being. They welcomed our work with them, as did Kazakhstan and Ukraine and other countries. At this time, there is no permissive environment, but we are going to stay very focused on the potential dangers posed by any storehouse or depot of such weapons.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary, for your time. Mr. Smith from New Jersey, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health and Human Rights, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome, Madam Secretary. Let me associate myself with the remarks of our distinguished chairwoman on Cuba. We had a hearing just a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Oscar Bichette, who had a 25-year sentence. He's now out of prison, but he is not out of prison. And he spoke via telephone right here. And the man is unbelievably brave. He's calling for freedom, human rights, and we've got to be very hard-lined, I believe, but also very prudent. So I would hope, you know, the gentlelady made a very, very important point about not attending, and I hope that will be the case. Let me ask you with regards to the Iranian pastor Yosef Nadarkhani. We will have a resolution on the floor later on today. If you could speak to the Iranians, if you would, and to the world. There is a ratcheting up of persecution against Christians that is unprecedented. I've held 2 hearings on the Coptic Christians, the kidnapping of Coptic Christian girls who are forced into Islam as minors and then given to a man in Egypt who happens to be Muslim, is outrageous. It's an act of trafficking, and it is not an isolated incident. It is a serious, ongoing, and pervasive human rights hearing. I actually held my first hearing on the global persecution of Christians on February 15, 1996. It was getting worse then. It is now awful. In China, North Korea, we all know people are tortured to death simply because they are Christians, if you could speak to that. I would like to ask you, if you would, and a very specific and yes or no answer might suffice, and I thank you for the briefing on Bosnia and the work you're doing to try to bring Bosnia into NATO, as well as the other countries that are in line. Is there any instance, Madam Secretary, or instances where the Obama administration has withheld or has threatened to withhold or plans to withhold or use its voice and vote at international lending institutions to reward with debt relief or loans, or to deny such, or in any other way provide a retaliatory means based on that nation's policies on abortion and based on that nation's support or opposition to resolutions at the UN regarding abortion?
Well, as to that second question, Congressman, I'd like to take it for the record because it had so many parts to it, and I don't want to give you an answer that is not as accurate as I can make it. So I will certainly get back to you on that. As to the very troubling case of Pastor Nardar Khani, you are 100% right. His case is particularly egregious, but it is unfortunately part of what we see as increasing discrimination and persecution on the basis of religion. In some parts of the world, it's sects of Islam. In some parts of the world, it's Christians. But wherever it occurs, it is deplorable against freedom of religion, against human rights that are universally recognized. The United States has condemned the sentence against Pastor Nardar Khani. We have pushed very hard, reached out to like-minded countries, international organizations to get a stay of execution, to get him released from prison. He's done nothing more than maintain his faith, and it is absolutely contrary to every element of the universal basis for human rights that someone like that would be condemned to death for being who he is, worshiping as he chooses, exercising his freedom of conscience. So we call on Iran to honor its own constitutional commitment to the protection of religious freedom and its obligations under international law, and they can begin by commuting this death sentence and letting this man go free.
If you could get back on the other question.
Yes.
As quickly. We hear from UN ambassadors that some are fearful they will lose foreign aid if they don't back the U.S. position on abortion at the United Nations. And that, you know, you're shaking your head no, so I'm happy to hear that, but if you could provide a very definitive answer, it would be very helpful. You probably saw the spate of articles that China is changing its policy slogans on the one child per couple policy, but not the law itself. That was one of the headlines that Yahoo News had. There's a whole spate of articles to that effect. I would hope that we would redouble our efforts to combat the one child per couple policy, the fact that there are so many missing girls. As we all know, the estimates are in excess of 100 million missing girls systematically exterminated simply because they happen to be girls. And by 2050, and I had a hearing on this very recently, I've had 38 congressional hearings on human rights abuse in China. By 2020, 40 to 50 men won't be able to find wives because they've been systematically eliminated. So China is becoming and will increase as a trafficking magnet. I'm almost out of time, but if you could really speak out strongly against forced abortion, forced sterilization, and for those baby girls in China who are suffering immensely, as
Thank
well
you,
as their
Mr.
mothers.
Smith. Thank you very much. Mr. Sherman, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade is recognized.
Madam Secretary, glad to have you back here. I want to join so many of my colleagues who have praised your work for our country and how much you've been able to accomplish with less than 1% of our budget. I've got a lot of topics to cover and would expect that you just want to respond for the record, but interrupt me at any point if the spirit moves you. The first is to focus on the Javak region of Georgia. We have been very generous to the Republic of Georgia. Javak is a region in southern Georgia with a large ethnic Armenian population, and the Embassy of Georgia is now in support of the idea of the United States focusing a good chunk of its aid for Georgia on the Javak region. This would help bind Javak to the Republic of Georgia and would help achieve our goals in the Caucasus. Last time you were here, I mentioned the idea of Voice of America broadcasting in the Sindhi language. This committee adopted my amendment unanimously to direct the Voice of America to spend $1.5 million broadcasting in the Sindhi language. I am not sure that that bill will become law, but it does show the wisdom of the committee. There are elements in the government in Islamabad who would prefer to try to impose the Urdu language on the entire country. In fact, the idea of imposing the Urdu language on what was then East Bengal created, as much as anything, the independent Republic of Bangladesh. And I would hope that in deciding whether to broadcast in the Sindhi language, we not try to accommodate the most extreme nationalistic or just extreme position of some elements in Islamabad, because right now we're broadcasting in Urdu, and Sindhi is spoken by far more people in Pakistan. And we do have a very complicated relationship with the Pakistani government. We need to reach out to the Pakistani people, particularly those in the Sufi-influenced south of Pakistan, where the version of Islam is so compatible with American values. I know I won't be the only person up here to talk about Camp Liberty and how important it is that we assure the humanitarian safety of everyone who is there. There are certain elements to how that camp has been set up that makes it look not almost like a prison camp. There are reports that the residents have no access to lawyers, their family, no freedom of movement. And obviously the Iranian government is going to be pressing the Iraqis to be as inhumane as possible to the residents of that camp. And I hope that we will be pressing on the other side. And then finally, and this is a propitious day with regard to this issue, as you may know, there is the SWIFT system, which is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. There's an effort to exclude all Iranian banks from that system. And earlier today, I had a chance to talk to Chairman Bernanke, who represents us in the SWIFT system and has a role in supervising that system. And he said that he didn't have a national security advisor over at the Federal Reserve and would want to hear from elements of the government that do focus on national security, whether it is in our interest not just to exclude some Iranian banks, but all Iranian banks from the SWIFT system, thus further isolating Iran the financial system. And so perhaps you could respond here as to whether you would advise the chairman to do everything possible to exclude all Iranian banks from the SWIFT system.
Yes, we certainly would. And we believe that using the SWIFT system is a very effective way of further isolating Iran and the Iranian flow of financial transactions. So we will engage with the Federal Reserve in terms of providing such information. And with respect to all of your other issues, Congressman, we will get back to you in a timely manner.
Thank you. And I hope your advice to Bernanke would be all Iranian banks, not just those that have been sanctioned by the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Burton, the chairman on Europe and Eurasia, is recognized.
Madam Secretary, it's nice seeing you again. I understand that today or yesterday there was an indication that we might once again open some kind of dialogue with North Korea. And I just checked, and we gave North Korea, during the Clinton administration, over $1 billion in fuel and food aid, as well as money we spent building their light water reactor. And of course, they violated the agreement that they made. The only reason I bring that up is I hope that if we start a dialogue with them, we realize that their history is one of that you certainly can't trust. And even though Kim Jong-il's gone and we have a new leader there, I think it's extremely important that the State Department get everything written in blood, so to speak, to make sure that we're not shafted again. Recently, Tom Donilon and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs went over to visit Israel, and the tone of the reports that I received, and of course all this isn't in writing, but the tone was that they were urging Israel not to take any unilateral action as far as an attack on Iran is concerned. And I know that just recently they said that they certainly weren't going to in any way involve, so to speak, the United States to give us some semblance of separation from that. I wonder why it is that the administration doesn't give complete support to Israel and say, you know, if Iran continues with its program, we will do whatever is necessary to stop that program, and give Israel the support that I think they need. Right now, they're surrounded by all of the potential enemies you can count, and they really need, I think, in the world of public relations, to know, and the world to know, that the United States is with them through thick and thin. The last thing I talked to you about when you were here before, and I'll give you a chance to respond, was I've been very concerned about the entire northern tier of Africa and the Persian Gulf becoming radicalized. Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, maybe Syria, and in the Persian Gulf area, I've talked to a number of the ambassadors and others there. They're all concerned about radicalism taking over. And although we want to get rid of people like Muammar Gaddafi and Mubarak, although he was, a pretty good friend as far as the Camp David Accords are concerned, although we want to get rid of the bad guys, I'd like to know what we're doing to guarantee that we're not supporting radical Islamists who are going to end up causing a bigger problem than the problem we already had. I understand that we want to get rid of people that are persecuting their populations, but we also have to be concerned about what it means to the United States as far as energy is concerned and stability in the region, Israel, and all those things. And I'd like to know what guarantees we have that the governments that we're supporting over there, or the fledgling governments that we're supporting over there, are not going to be radicalized and start supporting and implementing Sharia law, and thus we would face a more difficult problem down the road than we face right now.
Well, Congressman, with respect to Israel, I can assure you that not only does the Obama administration strongly support the defense and security of Israel, but we have put more money behind that pledge than has ever been put before. We've increased U.S. security assistance to Israel every year since FY09. This budget includes $3.1 billion for foreign military financing, a $25 million increase from the FY12 level. We have a very strong support for Israel's missile defense programs, which are an essential aspect of what Israel needs in these very challenging times. And, Prime Minister Netanyahu has called the bilateral security cooperation unprecedented, particularly with respect to cooperative missile defense developments and realistic military exercises. So there is an ongoing consultation at the very highest levels between our two governments, and we share our assessments with the Israelis. We listen to their assessments, and I think that the Prime Minister's words really speak for themselves, that it's unprecedented, the level of cooperation and funding that we're providing, and I will look forward to providing an answer on the record regarding North Africa. I just returned from a visit to Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. I think we have an opportunity there, but I am conscious of the risks and dangers you identified.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Burton. Mr. Meeks, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Secretary, it's always a delight to have you before us, and I just want to say on behalf of, I believe, all of the American people, what a splendid job that you're doing. I have 3 questions that I'm going to try to ask you in the time that we have allotted. One, about our complex relationship with Russia, which I believe presents significant accomplishments, challenges, and opportunities, and our areas of disagreement are sometimes profound and frustrate multilateral efforts for coordinated action to confront threats of life, as in Syria, or global security, as in Iran. Notably, however, the Cold War is behind us, and the United States and Russia are no longer eyeball to eyeball with fingers posed over red buttons that would release arsenals aimed at one another. and we are often now elbow to elbow at conference tables, which I think is a good thing. Madam Secretary, will you comment on your priorities and the strategy with respect to Russia? You may know or may not know that I am particularly interested in expanding trade and economic relationship with Russia, which in the year ahead I hope will be a good news story for the United States. Secondly, Turkey, which continues to be a strategically important player in a challenging part of the world. In fact, Turkey has demonstrated leadership in supporting change and peace in Syria and receiving the tens of thousands of Syrian refugees who spill across the common border. They have stepped into the spotlight, too, regarding events in the Middle East and North Africa, and they facilitate U.S. redeployments from Iraq. Can you speak about Turkey's growing prominence, including the United States' relationship with Turkey, including what seem to be rough spots with Israel and Iran? And lastly, the U.S. leads the world in promoting racial and ethnic tolerance and gender empowerment. And I want to commend you for your personal leadership in these efforts. I would like to focus your attention for just a second on the U.S.-Brazil Joint Action Plan, as well as the U.S.-Colombia Action Plan to promote racial and ethnic equality, and like to hear about your plans for continuing these works on these initiatives, especially since I didn't see or was not clear about the funding of these initiatives in 2013. And it's very much concern to me whether that's going to continue in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere. And when I was in Brussels, now being the ranking Democrat on Europe, there's been our European counterparts have expressed a strong interest in concluding such a joint action plan with us also. And so I was wondering if the State Department could expand this initiative and look into negotiating an agreement with the EU.
Well, thank you very much for that description of a lot of the most important issues that we face. Let me focus at the start on Russia, because there will be coming before the Congress important work to be done in order for American businesses to benefit from Russia's membership in the WTO. The United States believes that having Russia in the WTO is very much in the interests of the kind of rules-based economic system that we think benefits Americans, and that we are very keen on establishing firmly for the 21st century. So we are looking to have the Congress vote to grant permanent normal trade relations to Russia, because it's a vote to create American jobs for U.S. businesses, farmers, and workers to receive the maximum benefit from Russia's entry into the WTO. We have to give unconditional permanent normal trading relations treatment to Russian goods that we provide to all WTO members. That commitment requires us to terminate the application of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And Jackson-Vanik achieved its historic purpose by helping thousands of Jews emigrate from the Soviet Union. And Jackson-Vanik is not any longer the kind of active tool that we need to promote universal human rights vis-a-vis Russia, because we want to continue to press for human rights inside Russia. But failure to lift Jackson-Vanik will put our farmers, our manufacturers, American businesses at a disadvantage. So we very much hope that the Congress will grant PNTR to Russia, lift Jackson-Vanik, recognize the need to keep pressing on human rights inside Russia, and create American jobs as a result. And with respect to your other very important questions and areas of concern, Congressman, I'll just end by saying we strongly support the work we're doing with Colombia and Brazil to promote racial and ethnic equality. We do have the means to continue to work on that within the existing budget, and it's a very high priority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meeks. Madam Secretary, Mr. Rohrabacher of California, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I, too, respect the good job you're doing. We have some disagreements, but the fact is you work hard and you take your job seriously, and probably of all the members of the Obama administration, you have more respect here in Capitol Hill than your other colleagues. Sorry, that's a backhanded compliment. I shouldn't have said that. But there are many lives that depend directly on the decisions you make in your job. And I'd like to ask two questions about relating directly to people who are now in grave danger, who will be affected by your decision-making. And then after that, if I have some other time, I'll ask a couple other questions. The first one is about Dr. Afridi in Pakistan. As you are aware, it is now illegal for the government of Pakistan to receive any aid money from the United States unless you, as the Secretary of State, certify that Pakistan is cooperating with the United States in counterterrorism efforts and preventing terrorists from basing their operations in Pakistan. Well, of course, the one Pakistani who did cooperate with us was Dr. Afridi, who was the medical doctor who helped provide the information that led our Navy SEALs to where Osama bin Laden was hiding. But he now has been arrested by the Pakistani government and is facing a treason charge. His property's been confiscated, his office staff has been fired, and he's being called a national criminal by that government. So can you certify, are you able to certify that Pakistan is cooperating with us as long as Dr. Afridi, the man who helped us get Osama bin Laden, is in custody and being charged with treason?
Well, Congressman, I agree that there is no basis for holding Dr. Afridi or any of his staff. In fact, I think his work on behalf of the effort to take down bin Laden was in Pakistan's interests as well as the United States' interests. And we have made that view very well known. We will continue to press it, and you know, it is going to be taken into account as we move forward.
Well, if they do not let Dr. Afridi go, let me just put everybody on notice here, and I believe that we're going to be watching this closely. There is nothing that could suggest that Pakistan is cooperating with us in the fight against terrorism when they have Dr. Afridi, the man who helped us get Osama bin Laden, in prison and are treating him this way. That is their decision of non-cooperation. About one other group whose lives are in danger, there are 3,000 Iranian exiles who have been residing in Iraq, who you are fully aware of. Because they were enemies and are enemies of the Iranian mullah dictatorship, these exile members, who are members of the MEK, are in great danger. Our designation to their organization as a terrorist organization has been a major stumbling block in efforts to resettle them and take them to safety. Are we going to wait until there's some kind of another slaughter of these people? They already were slaughtered down, they're unarmed, before we act to try to get them resettled? Something as easy as trying to take that designation off of the terrorist organization would help dramatically, and we can do that unilaterally.
Well, first, we are deeply concerned about the security and safety of the residents of Camp Ashraf. And we have supported the work of the United Nations to find a path forward to relocate the residents, and that has now begun. We fully support the MOU signed in December between the United Nations and the government of Iraq, and it includes commitments from the Iraqi government for the safety and security of the new camp where the relocation is taking place. As you know, there were 397 residents relocated on February 18th. There were complications, but it was peaceful. There was no violence. The safety so far has been protected, and we are watching that very closely. We continue to work on our review of the MEK's designation as a foreign terrorist organization in accordance with the D.C. Circuit's decision and applicable law. And I would note that not every resident relocated to what used to be Camp Liberty is now Camp Huria may be an MEK member. The organization's structure and history dictate that we take a serious look at each individual, not prejudge membership or the conditions of that person's presence at Ashraf. And, you know, once again, the UNHCR process will be expedited. So no government has raised the FTO issue with the Department of State as a bar to receiving individuals. And we're going to continue to work to ensure the safety and security. And we think that we have a good plan. And I would say, Congressman, that Given the ongoing efforts to relocate the residents, MEK cooperation in the successful and peaceful closure of Camp Ashraf, the MEK's main paramilitary base, will be a key factor in any decision regarding the MEK's FTO status.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Engel of New York, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Madam Secretary. The United States is proud of you, but in New York, we're especially proud of you. I want to ask 3 questions. I'll try to do them one at a time. I've just come back from a trip to Israel, where I've met with people at the highest levels of government. There is a big fear in Israel that the United States is adjusting to the containment of Iranian nuclear weapons rather than stopping them at all costs. And as you, of course, know, we have said let sanctions work, but many in Israel believe that if we wait too long, we'll be at the point of no return, and then Iran will not be stopped at all. Can you please comment on that and assure us that we are not for a position of containment?
Our policy, Congressman, is prevention. Our policy is to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons capability. We have a 2-track policy: pressure and engagement. We are pursuing both simultaneously to that end.
Okay, thank you. I want to speak with you about the Balkans. You and I had several discussions in the past week or so about Kosovo, and I want to just praise you publicly for guaranteeing that Kosovo's rights as a sovereign country remain secure throughout recent negotiations with the EU and Serbia. While I'm glad that Kosovo will take its rightful place as a sovereign state in regional negotiations, and I commend Prime Minister Thaci for taking this difficult decision, I'm concerned that Belgrade is advancing to candidate status before meeting all of the EU's conditions and normalizing relations with Kosovo. And at the same time, as you and I discussed, I hope the U.S. will seek additional ways to support Kosovo during this process, including through the Millennium Challenge program and by pressing the EU to stop dragging its feet on Kosovo's European future and to make sure that Serbia implements deals to which it agrees.
Well, I thank you for your constant support of Kosovo and the Kosovar people. I agree with you that Prime Minister Thaci showed great leadership. The invitation to candidacy that the EU has extended to Serbia has many milestones along the way, and resolving border issues, resolving a lot of the unfinished business that has to be negotiated between Serbia and Kosovo are some of those. At the same time, I think it's very important that the European Union has reached out to Kosovo and is working to move Kosovo closer to European integration as well. This is a difficult, piece of business. It's a historically complex area, as you know better than most, Congressman, but I think we are slowly making progress, and I'm going to continue to press forward.
Thank you. 2 things about the Western Hemisphere, which I am the ranking member. The FARC has recently announced that it is going to release some of its political prisoners and want people to believe that they've reformed. While I'm obviously skeptical about anything that the FARC says, I'm wondering if you can comment. President Santos of Colombia, of course, has said that it's a good move in the right direction, but not nearly enough. I'm wondering if we could have your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that President Santos is exactly right. It is a good move, long overdue, to end their kidnapping and their illegal detention of innocent people. But there is a lot yet to be finalized. I think that this Congress and administrations of both parties should take a certain amount of credit for Plan Colombia, for sticking with it, for providing the Colombian government and the Colombian people with the means to be able to defend themselves against a paramilitary terrorist organization and the drug traffickers. So, yes, this is a good step, but it's not enough yet.
Thank you. And finally, last year, this committee adopted a bipartisan amendment, which I authored, supporting the establishment of U.S. embassies in the 5 Caribbean countries where we have none. These embassies would be similar to the post we have in Grenada and would show our Caribbean partners that we pay attention to their region, and would, of course, also help connect millions of Caribbean Americans with their ancestral homelands. It'll be minimal or no cost because our representation would be established with only 5 of the hundreds of diplomats returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Well, of course, we believe strongly in having positive diplomatic relations with our Eastern Caribbean friends and partners. And it's a matter of cost, it's a matter of resources. I will respond to you in writing because it's a difficult trade-off for us, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
Madam
Mr.
Chairman.
Engel, Madam Secretary. And Mr. Royce, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Secretary, you and I have talked about Joseph Kony, who abducted 30,000 children. The boys he turned into child soldiers, the girls into concubines, and some of the horrible circumstances that we've had with some of the worst human rights abusers. And likewise, people like Victor Boot, who's now in custody, but a gun runner, supreme, who, as an arms trafficker, armed both sides of some civil conflicts. There is a rewards program the State Department has, and I have legislation to expand that to include transnational organized crime, to go after people like Victor Boot, as well as those engaged in the worst human rights abuses, like Joseph Kony. And I know that your department is interested in putting a price on the head of people like Kony so that we can find their whereabouts. And, you know, I know the goal is to take him off the battlefield, and we would need that to do that. So we'll have a hearing next week on this subject. I wanted your thoughts, if I could.
Well, Congressman, this is the first time I've heard of your legislation, but speaking personally, I would support it because I have the responsibility of signing off on rewards that go to people who have helped us apprehend, you know, serious criminals and terrorists. I think it's a good program. It does provide incentives. So I would be very interested in working with you. It's also a lot less expensive than some of the alternatives of trying to track down some of these bad guys. So let's work together on that.
It's time-tested.
Yes.
Well, again, Madam Secretary, on another subject this morning, it was announced that North Korea has agreed to suspend its uranium enrichment and to a moratorium, but that was announced in tandem with the Obama administration's finalizing its details on food aid to North Korea, 240,000 metric tons of that of food aid. I had legislation passed last year that prohibited food aid to any country that diverted it for unauthorized use. And I'll just explain my concern here. The French NGOs told us of monitoring the food aid, which ended up on the food exchange in North Korea's capital. And likewise, we have numerous examples of citing of how food aid went to the military in North Korea. So the law now would indicate that we'd have to verify that. And we have been duped a number of times by North Korea on these agreements. Of course, what I'm most concerned about is when they sell it on the food exchange for hard currency, it goes into their weapons program, reportedly. So I would ask you about that and get your response.
Well, first of all, I think you're right to be cautious. We are too. You know, the provision of humanitarian assistance is something that we do because of the concern we have for the welfare and well-being of people, including those who are starving in North Korea. And we've done a series of assessments and concluded that a targeted 240,000 metric ton nutritional assistance package that targets the key vulnerable groups, mostly women and children, is merited. But before any assistance program could begin, we have to reach agreement on monitoring mechanisms to ensure that the food is reaching the people that we intend it for. And that will be our responsibility to try to set up those mechanisms and to, be as sure as we can be that it's going to be put to the right use.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and within the confines of the new law, because We do have to verify this. I have suggested a crackdown on North Korea's illicit activities. I've seen in the past where that was effective, when they were counterfeiting $100 bills. We had the sanctions on the Banco Delta Asia. They were using that to run their illicit activities through. A lot of their drug smuggling and cigarettes and other activities. When you cut off that kind of currency, you force the regime to come to the table. And I guess one of my great frustrations was, although we shut that down for a number of months, and he couldn't pay his generals, and the words we were getting back from defectors was that they couldn't get the parts. There was a piece for a satellite that they needed, or actually this was for a missile program. They needed the gyroscope. They were trying to buy it on the black market. They didn't have the money for it because we had effectively, with sanctions, done this, and then the sanctions were lifted. My hope would be that the administration would approach this from the standpoint that that could be effective. And I wanted to ask about whether the administration was going to follow through on the illicit activities.
Thank you, Mr. Royce. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Carnahan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Madam Secretary, it's great to have you back. Just first want to say thank you for following up with Co-Chair Chris Smith, Chairman Smith, and I with the Bosnian Caucus and those concerns that we had raised earlier. Given the fact that they have the new government in place, we hope that continued U.S. and international support can help move them forward. So first of all, thank you for that. Also wanted to commend you on the recently announced international partnership, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to reduce short-term pollutants. It underscores the global nature of the challenge, as well as the advantages to working with our partners at the UN and around the world. I wanted to ask, is that investment paid off in terms of stronger commitments by developing countries? And can we count on them to continue and fulfill those commitments if we are not honoring our pledges?
Well, thank you for raising that, Congressman, because we continue to believe that climate change and the consequences of climate change pose national security problems to us. And so we are looking for ways to try to move forward where we can and take practical steps. The fact is that the short-term climate forcers, things like methane, things like black soot or black carbon and soot, are more easily dealt with than carbon dioxide. And I think that what we've put together here, which is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, has developed countries like Sweden, underdeveloped countries like Bangladesh, developing countries like Ghana, Canada, and we've had a really positive response from countries around the world asking how they can be involved. So we think this is a way to help cut down on about 40% of what the pollutants in the atmosphere are that affects climate change. So we're going to be promoting this issue. It's not as controversial. It's not as far-reaching. We still have to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions and try to come to grips with CO2. But it gives us something that people can do. And I'll give you a quick example. We have a global alliance on clean cook stoves. How women cook, about 2 billion of them around the world, creates respiratory illnesses, puts a lot of soot, black carbon into the atmosphere. If we can create a market for a more clean burning cook stove, we improve health and we improve the environment at the same time. So there's a lot of win-win strategies that we're working on here.
Great. Thank you. I also wanted to follow up on the CIGAR audit report of the police development program, and it revealed issues in Iraq of poor planning, mismanagement, inefficient evaluation metrics. So in this current budget, what's being done to enhance those monitoring mechanisms in a way that ensures that police training is really being ramped up the way it needs to be? It's also ensuring the integrity of our tax dollars, And really related to that, as this similar kind of transition is approaching, fast approaching in Afghanistan, you know, the lessons we've learned in this transition in Iraq, how can we apply those in Afghanistan as well?
Well, the police development program has been operating since October 1, 2011, when the State Department became the U.S. lead for police development. Since October, our senior police advisors, who are the most experienced group of police advisors ever fielded by the U.S. government, have had approximately 690 total mentoring and advising sessions with over 86 Iraqi counterparts. And we've recently completed an assessment of Iraq's Ministry of Interior and Police Services so that we can really refine how we are monitoring and what kind of performance measurements we need. I think that CIGAR performs a valuable oversight service. We welcome helpful recommendations about how to make the police development program better. We are implementing the recommendations from the fall audit. And we're going to continue to look at opportunities to improve the effectiveness of these programs. We think they're critical to the stability and security of Iraq. So we take it very seriously, and we take recommendations from CIGAR and others very seriously as well.
And finally, in my remaining time, I just want to add my voices to others that about our continued effective and full engagement at the UN. Certainly not a perfect body, but one that certainly there have been some successes there, vital for our security and economic interest, and appreciate those continued efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shabbat, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Middle East and South Asia, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, because of limited time, I'd like to raise 3 issues and then give you the remaining amount of my time to address them. First, Iran. On the subject of the Iranian nuclear program, the fiscal year 2013 Congressional Budget Justification notes that, quote, the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs will maintain pressure through sanctions to encourage Iran to return to the negotiating table, unquote. This policy, however, is essentially the same unchanged Iran policy that the administration has had since it took power back in January of 2009, engagement and pressure. On July 12, 2009, over 2.5 years ago, you stated that, quote, we understand the importance of offering to engage Iran and giving its leaders a clear choice. The opportunity will not remain open indefinitely, unquote. And we enter as we enter year 4 of this policy, it seems to me to be painfully obvious that this administration's policy is not only the same, but that it's failed to achieve the core objective, persuading the regime in Tehran to abandon its pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. Just this morning, in your testimony before the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, you said that you believe we are making progress on the sanctions front. My question is, how have these sanctions actually altered the Iranian regime's calculation about its nuclear program? And let me say, I don't think merely getting them to the table is enough. We've seen numerous times that the regime in Tehran uses negotiations as a delaying tactic, and that a willingness to negotiate does not equal a willingness to make concessions. Second, I'd like to ask you about Iraq. Within hours of the departure of the final U.S. convoy, a political crisis started occurring in Iraq, which, if not checked, has the potential to throw the entire country back into sectarian civil war that we spent years working to resolve. Many Iraqis continue to die in daily attacks across the country, and according to one report, our influence over the Maliki government has diminished significantly. The State Department Congressional Budget Justification notes that, quote, renewed sectarian conflict or increased interference by malign regional actors seeking to fill a vacuum left by U.S. disengagement would pose a significant threat to U.S. influence in the region, unquote. It seems undeniable that the continued presence of even a modicum of U.S. troops would have resulted in far more stability and security than we are seeing now. Given our lack of a military presence and our diminished diplomatic leverage, how does the administration plan to deal with the current deterioration on the ground in Iraq? And finally, Madam Secretary, if I may, I'd like to briefly touch upon the issue of outstanding claims by American companies against the government of Saudi Arabia. In the last 20 years or so, thanks in large part to congressional and executive branch pressure, a number of previously unsettled cases involving more than a dozen American firms, totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million, have been resolved. I learned last year that at least one such unsettled claim with the Saudis remains. Despite continued efforts by the party, Gibbs and Hill, the U.S. government, and repeated encouragement from members of Congress, the claim resulting from a desalinization project in the late 70s and early 80s and totaling, I'm told, more than $130 million, has still not been settled. I discussed this case with the Saudi petroleum minister when I met with him in Riyadh last year, and I offered an amendment to the Foreign Relations Authorization Bill to further encourage the Saudis to move expeditiously to resolve this claim. I'd be happy to work with your office on this issue. This claim is of significant importance to an American company and their workers, and it should be of importance to the reputation of the Saudi government, which I'm sure does not want to be known as one which does not pay its bills. And you've got about a minute for all that, Madam Secretary.
Well, I'll take the last one because that's shorter, and then get back to you on the important questions concerning Iran and Iraq. State Department is well familiar with the Gibbs and Hill contract dispute. It's been raised at high levels for a number of years. At the request of Counsel for Hill International, the State Department recently conducted a review of all of our records in this matter. We have a standing invitation to officers of Hill International to come in and discuss the results of this review, to bring not only representatives but the counsel of the company. We regularly meet with representatives of Hill International because they still do business in Saudi Arabia. In fact, they do quite a bit of business, and you know, they come in and talk to us about commercial ventures and business climate. So if they wish to come in and talk to us about our review of the records, we stand ready to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mi hermano cubano-americano. Now, that was easy enough for everybody to understand. Mr. Sears of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for the service that you give this country. You certainly make us proud, and I don't know how you do it, but every time I see you, you're in a different country. It's amazing. I also want to commend the administration for standing firm on Cuba not participating in the Summit of the Americas. And I also wish to add that if we could use some of our pull with the OAS, maybe they could speak up a little louder about the human abuses that are occurring in Cuba currently. And with that, it brings me to Alan Gross, and I know you mentioned Alan Gross before, but I just want to know that there is no negotiations going on for a swap between the Cuban spies that are in prison for Alan Gross. I know that we had two senators were in Cuba a couple of days ago, and I was just wondering if you know anything about any kind of negotiations for a swap.
Well, I have to say that you know, the continuing imprisonment of Alan Gross is deplorable. It is wrong. It is a violation of human decency as well as human rights. And at every single meeting that we possibly can arrange, we raise this issue. We call people around the world to raise this issue because Mr. Gross deserves to come home. At no point, however, has the United States government been willing to give any unilateral concessions to the Castro regime or to ease sanctions as a means to secure Mr. Gross's release. We think this should be done as a matter of humanitarian concern, as evidence that you know, the Castro regime is you know, willing to demonstrate that it is you know, moving in a different direction, but it hasn't happened yet. So we have not had any success in our diplomacy. We'd like to see Mr. Gross home, but we have made no deals. We've offered no concessions, and we don't intend to do so.
Thank you. I also like to associate myself with my colleague, Chris Smith, on the human rights abuses, especially what's going on in Egypt with the Coptic Christians. I have a big population of Coptic Christians in my district, and they're very concerned about the family members that they have back home, and I hope that we continue to speak up on their behalf. I also, I know you didn't address this, but if we could use our leverage with the OAS to speak up more on human rights abuses, that would be great. And one of the things that is my pet peeve, I know that the State Department operation funding for Iraq has been reduced. I think this year is going to be $4.8 billion. And I know that the Department of Defense also has reduced from 9.6 to 2.9, almost $3 billion. I was just wondering if any of that money is used for infrastructure building in Iraq. We have a situation in America where our infrastructure is falling apart. And since I've been here, we've been giving money to Iraq to build their infrastructure. So I was just wondering how many of this money is going to be used. Do you know? Or,
Well, Congressman, as you know, we have dramatically scaled back on what we spend in Iraq, primarily because the military has left in accordance with agreements that were negotiated by the prior administration, and now what we are focused on is our civilian president. So we don't fund Iraqi infrastructure any longer, and what was funded was primarily on the military side, not the civilian side.
Okay. And getting back to Cuba on my last issue, we have a criminal who killed a state trooper in New Jersey, Joanne Chesimard. She's been living in Cuba for over 20 years. She shot a state trooper point blank. And every time I'm back in the States and I run into the state troopers, they want me to raise this issue to see if the State Department, when you meet with Cuba or when you do your conversations with some of the Cuban counterparts, is the issue of Joanne Chesimard ever raised, or is it just a forgotten issue?
Well, it will be now raised if it hasn't been raised, and I thank you for raising it because I well remember that terrible case, and I'm confident it has been raised, but I will assure you and the state troopers in New Jersey it will continue to be raised in the future.
Okay. Madam Secretary, thank you for your service to this country.
Thank you so much. My Florida colleague, Mr. Mack, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also would like to thank the Secretary for being here and making herself available to questions from the committee. I want to go and continue to explore the Keystone XL pipeline, but I first want to, just for a point of clarification for everyone, we would much rather, as a policy in the United States, buy oil from our friends and allies in Canada than we would from Venezuela. Would you agree with that? That's a
Yes, yes, and we do buy, as you know, a lot of oil from Canada.
If we had the option to stop buying oil from Venezuela and get more oil from Canada, that is also a policy that we would pursue, wouldn't it?
Well, obviously, we would rather buy oil from friendly countries, and we are doing everything we can to diversify our oil supply, including producing more oil here in the United States, which is all to the good.
So why the flip-flop on the Keystone XL pipeline?
I don't think there was any flip-flop, Congressman. I think that this was always a matter that had to be evaluated in accordance with legal and regulatory standards. Certainly, energy security considerations was a key factor, but not the only factor. There was a lot of concern on the part of one state through which the pipeline traveled.
And on that note, your environmental impact statement approved the original route, and now there's been an agreement upon another route that the governor and others have come out and supported, correct?
Well, I think that what the finding is that there was minimal environmental disruption, but the national interest consideration had not yet been finalized, which is why State Department representatives fanned out across the states affected, and there were quite large and contentious and emotional meetings in Nebraska, and a plea by the governor and everybody else that a different route be considered. And you know, once that was requested, and it was complicated because Nebraska didn't have legislation that really got it into the business of judging routes before, but they were concerned because of the, you know, the sandhills and the like. Once they demanded a different route, and then there was an effort to work out a different route, the Congress, of course, through an amendment to the payroll tax cut, said, no, you have to make a decision right now, and legally, there was no alternative but to deny the permit. That we did not recommend to the President that the answer be no, but that the presidential permit for the project be denied at that time, because there would have been, I think, at a conservative estimate, several hundred lawsuits if there had been any other decision made, which would have pushed the you know, the decision, whatever it might be, far into the future.
So are you prepared to do it now then?
We have no pending application now. There's no pending application.
If you had an application, would you approve it now? Has all of the other scenarios been?
No, Congressman, we would have to go through the process because it would be a new application. Now, what TransCanada is doing is announcing that it's...
Because my time is limited, if I can get to... I mean, even the former President, Bill Clinton, says embrace it, and we need to move forward with the Keystone XL pipeline.
He's a very smart man. But he unfortunately is not bound by the laws and regulations any longer of the United States to make decisions that follow a certain procedure, and that's what we have to do.
So is it a mistake for the former president to say embrace it?
Of course not. I think it's not a mistake for people. This is America. People say they embrace it. People say they hate it. Our job is to, you know, take a very clear-eyed look at what the facts are. There is no pending application.
Did the White House ask you to delay the process?
No, no. We were, our job was to make a recommendation.
Here's where I have the problem, because in conversations that you and I have had, and also in front of committees, you have led us to believe that it is something that the State Department was going to approve. And it just seems a little fishy to me that at the height of this thing, that it seems that the President found a way to wiggle out of it and wants to make you the scapegoat. And I don't understand why. The facts don't mesh up.
Well, you know, Congressman, that's just not how we see it. I think that the people in the State Department, I was fully and regularly briefed on the department's review process. I, you know, fully support the recommendation that the department made. You know, this is a difficult decision for the State Department to make because most other pipelines are not within the purview of the State Department. We don't have the kind of staff experience, expertise, and numbers that you have in other places with the United States government. But under the laws, if that pipeline crosses an international border, then it's our responsibility. So what TransCanada is doing is announcing they're going to start building parts of the pipeline that don't cross the international border. But I have to defend the process that the State Department went through, which was fully in accord with the laws of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mack, Madam Secretary. Another Florida colleague, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. It is safe to say that certainly here on the Hill and around the world, you are extraordinarily respected for the job you do, and I particularly would like to thank you for your leadership in the critical areas of stability in the Middle East, preventing a nuclear-armed Iran, human rights, and in particular, your continued strong advocacy for foreign assistance. I'd like to talk first about Syria, and rather than continue the discussion that you've had already on what happens, what's happening now in Syria ultimately ends, I want to talk about what's happening right at this moment. And in particular, just today it was reported that 23 people were killed when Syrian troops ambushed a group trying to smuggle Western journalists out of the country. I don't know whether the body of Marie Colvin, the American who wrote for the Sunday Times of London, whether that body has been recovered. If you have information, I would welcome that. The same with the Frenchman Remy Olchlik. The fact is that even as we talk about the big picture in Syria, the humanitarian situation deteriorates daily. Food and medicine is not being delivered to civilians. It is a tragic situation for the people of Syria, and I'd like you to address that and specifically what you can do and what we can do to alleviate those concerns now and to convince the Russians and the Chinese to, notwithstanding their views on the Assad regime, to at least support a humanitarian ceasefire and put pressure on Assad to permit a humanitarian ceasefire so that the people of Syria can at least receive the basic foodstuffs and medicine that they desperately need.
Well, Congressman, I share your concern and your outrage. Every day that goes by just compounds the crimes against humanity committed by this regime and their security forces. When we met in Tunisia last Friday, we made three commitments. First, to increase humanitarian aid. I announced a $10 million commitment to assistance projects. Secondly, to keep working with the opposition so that they get stronger, more effective, and that they're inclusive so they truly represent all Syrians. And thirdly, to keep pressing for a political resolution. And the Arab League plan, which called for Assad to step aside, is the plan that people feel most comfortable pushing. You know, the fact is, access is a terrible problem. There's not even a willingness on the part of the Assad regime to let the Syrian Red Crescent in, to pick up bodies, to deliver medical supplies and provisions. And they effectively not only block such aid, but they target those who are trying to provide it. We see a brutal use of violence against the people of Syria and everyone trying to help them. So we're looking with our allies, particularly in the neighborhood, those who have borders, how do we get this aid in? How do we protect people who are trying to put it in? And we're going to continue to do everything we can, not only to help get that aid in, but pressure the Assad regime. And we are working actively to persuade the Russians and the Chinese that at the very least they ought to support humanitarian assistance, put aside the political disagreement we have about supporting, you know, a leader who has murdered so many of his people with, you know, artillery. Let's focus on how we help the Syrian people. So that's our goal right now.
I appreciate that. Switching gears in the remaining time I have, it had been, I believe, misreported that what was going to be the largest joint military exercise between the United States and Israel had been canceled because of a decision made by the administration. It was later reported that it was a decision made by the Israelis. If you could speak to the reason for that cancellation, what will come next, and whether, in terms of security cooperation, that type of joint military exercise, why it's important, and whether it's consistent with other joint military exercises like that we've engaged in.
Well, of course, you know, DOD is the agency to whom such a question should be directed, but I believe it is either in the process or has already been rescheduled. We have upped our security assistance to Israel. As I said earlier, Prime Minister Netanyahu calls our bilateral security commitment from the Obama administration unprecedented, and those include, you know, realistic and ongoing military exercises, which we think are very important.
I appreciate that. And Madam Chairman, if I may, just finally, and if I could, Madam Secretary, please encourage you to continue to press for information about my constituent, Robert Levinson. It is of great importance in my community, and I hope that you'll continue to press.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fortenberry is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, welcome.
There you are.
Let me start with a question about Egypt. In 1979, as a young person, I entered the Sinai Desert in the place where there was fighting between Israel and Egypt in 1973. And on a twisted pile of rubble and concrete were scrawled the words, "Here was the war, here is the peace." I was there in a jubilant time where there was a celebratory atmosphere of the newfound relationship between the United States and Egypt. The United States had successfully brokered that treaty, and the courage of President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin to extend their hands in friendship has left us with a stable foundation for peace for the last 30 years between those two countries. Now, with the latest event that has occurred, with the change of governing structures and a great deal of uncertainty and an unclear commitment to that path of peace, given the deal that we put together and the amount of aid that we've given both to Israel but to Egypt as well, and now with the effrontery of the Egyptian authorities arresting Americans who are simply there to help Egyptians, what is the administration's position on potentially suspending the aid package?
Well, Congressman, first of all, in all the discussions that we have had and that we are aware of that Egyptian authorities have had with other countries, they remain committed to the Camp David Accords, which we think is in Egypt's interest and certainly in Israel's interest. So we are mindful of the importance of ensuring the continuity of that peace and stability. And we don't want to prejudge what the new government will do, because I think it is fair to note there is no government yet. They're in the process of putting in place a government, and the people who are still there but not elected or appointed by the new authorities can't really make decisions, yet there's no president or executive authority yet chosen. So I counsel patience, because we first have to get to know who the government is, and we are working very hard through many different channels to develop relationships with the people who will be in the new parliament, for example. So right now I can report to you that there's an ongoing commitment to preserve the Camp David Accords. You know, we're having some difficult bumps right now. We're hoping to resolve the NGO situation very soon. Then I think we have to take stock of where we are and make a decision based on the facts.
Well, given certain tensions in the past with our Egyptian relationship, I have always argued publicly that it was better to grab the hand of friendship and hold it tighter to work through that. Now, it gets a lot more delicate now when there's an unclear pathway to potentially upholding these agreements that have worked so well, not only for the Israelis but the Egyptians. And for decades, I'm afraid that the international community has taken that Camp David Accord really for granted, but it is an important pathway for peace. Let me turn quickly to the President's Lord's Resistance Army Comprehensive Strategy. We voted unanimously in last year's State Department Authorization Act to allow for the deployment of military advisors in the region to bring Joseph Kony to justice. I'm concerned, though, that multilateral interest is potentially dissipating now. I think its cooperation among governments in the region is critical in this regard. Can you comment on this?
Well, first, I thank you for authorizing, encouraging such a comprehensive U.S. strategy to bring this murderer to justice. As you know, small teams of U.S. military advisors were deployed in December and January to forward locations in the LRA-affected areas. The advisors are working to create more cooperation among regional militaries and enhance their capacity. Although there are approximately only 100, we think they are force adders to what is already going on, and we have a clear goal, which is to enable local forces to end the reign of terror. And we think that this small number of U.S. advisors can play an outsized role in bringing about that conclusion.
Regional governments must be able to step in and assume the challenge moving forward.
Yes, and starting with regional militaries, but including regional governments.
Let me turn quickly before the time is up to urge you as well, and I think this came up earlier, to speak on behalf of Pastor Yusuf Nardakani, who is guilty of the crime in Iran for witnessing to his faith. Now, the last time you were here, you talked very forthrightly about your desire, yet struggles to talk about the need for religious freedom as new democratic ideals arise in
I'll let you
regions
finish that thought, Mr. Fortenberry, but we're out of time. But go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You'll have to give her some chocolate, though.
Excuse me?
He'll have to give you
Oh,
some
sorry.
shots.
No, no, no.
Going back to my train of thought, I'll try. But to continue to raise his issue as an example of how religious freedom is a natural right that is consistent with the ideals of all humanity. So I just urge you to not only try to save his life, but point to that as to how governments who are looking for more just human rights or better human rights conditions and more just forms of governance must treat the issue of religious freedom.
Thank you so much. Mr. Cardoza is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Clinton. It's great to have you here again. This will be my last year in Congress, and I hear rumors that it may be your last year as Secretary of State. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for your tremendous service to our country in so many different ways. Madam Secretary, I want to raise the issue of our ally, Portugal. I represent a number of Portuguese American residents, and I share that heritage. And there are a number of issues with regard to the Azores and visas and consulates that I'm very concerned about. The consulate in Ponta Delgada is being rumored to be on the list for closure. It's one of the original consulates of our nation, and it's something that I would ask that you do everything within your power to preserve. Certainly this is a budget discussion today, and so it's appropriate to discuss it in the budget. The second question that I would have is that there are questions of visas that members of citizens of Portugal would have to go to France in order to obtain certain kinds of permanent immigration visas or green cards to the United States. I understand the number may only be 150, but the relationship that we have with Portugal is so important. When the Gulf War first started, the original summit was on the Azores and in the Azores, and Portugal was the host country. There may not be a better friend of the United States anywhere in the world. I'd just like to have you discuss that if you can. And finally, I will share with you that I was somewhat dismayed a while back when the President indicated in the negotiating strategy of a reversion back to the 67 lines in Israel as part of where he thought it might end up. And maybe you could clarify that for me and for everyone, because that is something that I happen to have been in the country when these statements were made, and I'm not sure that the 67 lines are defensible or the correct. There may be adjusted lines, and so I'd just like to hear the administration's position again on that.
Well, first, with respect to Portugal, I share your view that Portugal is a wonderful friend and not only a good partner in NATO and in so many other areas, but the source of a lot of Portuguese Americans, culture, food, so much else. I will have to take those questions for the record, Congressman, because I want to look into the two areas that you raised, but I want to assure you that we highly value our relationship with Portugal and will be very careful in making any decisions that would affect the free flow of people and trade. Secondly, I think if you look at the President's speeches, first last May at the State Department and secondly before APAC, there's a very clear set of understandings that the President lays out, and there was no reference to going back to the exact borders. I mean, it would be based on negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians, and it is anticipated that there would be a certain set of decisions that would have to take into account what has happened in the years since. But certainly from our perspective, looking at those speeches and looking at the reaction in Israel, which was very positive to both of them together, and we obviously are pursuing with Israel and the Palestinians an effort to get the negotiations restarted, because there is no shortcut. We support the two-state solution. We want to see it negotiated by the parties themselves, and it's turned out to be quite challenging to do that for a variety of reasons. But our position remains the same, that any final status issue ultimately has to be decided by the parties. We and others can put forth suggestions, recommendations, and ideas about what would work, but it's a negotiation, and the negotiation has to be resolved by the two parties most affected.
I totally agree with you, Madam Secretary. Thank you for the reclarification, and I appreciate it. I'd just like to make a notation on my original point about the Azores. There's a base there that is of strategic importance to us. It's really more appropriate to bring up with the Secretary of Defense, but I'll share it since I have this opportunity today. Our base at Terceta in the Azores is critical and is being the totality of the things that are coming to pass, the potential closing of Ponta Delgada, the visa question, and the potential closing of the base at Terceta, is having a view within that sphere of that we don't care any longer. And I raise the issues in combination because I think it will strain relations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cardoza. Mr. McCall, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Recently, I led a delegation to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and it was very, very interesting. And we had a sit-down meeting with President Zardari, a very frank discussion. He looked at us in the eye and said that he had no knowledge that bin Laden was in his country. But we do know it's probably likely that lower-level officials knew of his presence in Pakistan. Then we had Dr. Afridi, who helped us over there, and now he's in prison for treason, as was pointed out earlier. They gave the Chinese access to the helicopter that was left behind at the compound. And then finally, the Haqqani network. And we talked about the Haqqani network. And I asked for his support, as you have, very strongly in the past, asked for his support to go after the Haqqani network. And he said he doesn't play, he goes after all terrorist organizations, not just the Haqqani. However, last year we had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, testified that with ISI support, Haqqani operatives planned and conducted a truck bomb attack as well as an assault on our embassy. We also have credible evidence that they were behind the June 28th attack against the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul and a host of other smaller but effective operations. In short, he said the Haqqani network acts as an arm of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. Which takes me to my next question. We're giving all this foreign aid to a country that is complicit in working with the terrorists who are killing Americans. I understand all the implications. Zardari referred to our relationship as like a bad marriage, but divorce is not an option. But when it comes to the funding, we're looking at crafting legislation that would essentially require the State Department to certify that they are not working with these networks, including Haqqani. And if that cannot be certified, then the foreign aid will be cut off. I wanted to get your thoughts on that legislation.
Well, I think, Congressman, what President Zardari told you on behalf of the civilian leadership of the government of Pakistan is true. He has been a good partner in going after terrorism that threatens his country and Afghanistan and our troops. We have no evidence of any high-level official knowing about bin Laden, but like you, I have to assume that lower-level people, had to have known something, but we haven't proven that. It could be asserted, but not yet proven. So this is a complicated, difficult relationship. And what we are doing now is making it very clear what our expectations have to be going forward. And there is no doubt in my mind that certain elements of the Pakistani government are more ambivalent about cracking down on terrorism than other elements. When I sit across from the foreign minister or talk to the ambassador or talk to the prime minister and others, I think they are very sincere. They know that the scourge of terrorism is killing Pakistanis. Zardari knows that terrorists killed his wife. And yet there has been relationships between terrorist groups and the military and the intelligence services for many decades. And what's unique now is that this democratically elected government has survived longer than any other democratically elected government For the first time in the Parliament, you have questions being asked of the military and the ISI. You have the Supreme Court asking questions about actions of the military and the ISI. So you see the strains and stresses of trying to have a civilian government in a democracy assert control over all elements of the government. And we want to continue to support the democratic trend inside Pakistan. So, you know, walking this line, trying to make sure what the levers we can pull are, where we can really put pressure, is basically how I spend a lot of my time. And I take seriously the underlying thrust of your question, and I will carefully evaluate all factors when it comes time to make a decision.
Let me just say, thank you for, you've been very strong about the Haqqani network. I think Zardari is sincere in his efforts, but I don't think he has a lot of control over his own military and the ISI, and I think that's part of the problem. And so I would urge you to continue your efforts to get them to fight with us against these terrorists rather than be complicit with them.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome, Madam Secretary. It's wonderful to have you back before the committee, and thank you for the thoughtfulness of your budget proposal, both in its fiscal responsibility and its diplomatic priorities. So I thank you for that, and thank and acknowledge all of the men and women who serve under your leadership at the State Department. You have helped really to restore America's position in the world, as our ranking member said, as a partner for peace and democracy, and we are all grateful and thank you for your service. And we've had a lot of discussions today about various parts of the world that are of great concern and particularly unsettled, and areas of great violence. And I'd like to really focus my inquiry on two areas really closer to home. And the first is, and I'll just articulate the questions and give you the balance of my time. The first is really about the sort of events in the Middle East in general, in Syria, in Iran, and in that region of the world, and its impact on our gas prices here in the United States. And I know that we, in my home state, we've seen a tremendous increase in gas prices, and almost 40 cents from a year ago today. And I'm wondering if you can speak to your perspective on how a variety of international events that you're closely monitoring might have an impact on fuel prices in the near term, and also what we're doing both diplomatically and in terms of development efforts in the long term to ensure that gas prices are stabilized, or that at least in the long term they're mitigated. Because I think, we hear a lot about how this unrest is contributing to a rise in gas prices, and some of us also know that a big part of it is speculation and gouging, and we're going to take up some legislation, hopefully, to address that. But I think events around the world are certainly impacting, and I'd love to hear your perspective on that. And the second issue I'd ask you to speak to is something I hear a lot about back at home. As you know, Rhode Island is a huge manufacturing state, and we're really engaged in this whole Make It in America agenda to rebuild and reinvigorate American manufacturing. And one of the challenges we face, and I hear from Rhode Island manufacturers, is about the Chinese and their behavior as trading partners, and their manipulation of currency, and their refusal to protect intellectual property, and the challenges of their policies of indigenous innovation and technology transfers. And so I'd like to hear you speak to some of the State Department's efforts diplomatically to really help even the playing field so that we can really rebuild American manufacturing in our country. And again, thank you. And I finally will associate myself with Congressman Cardozo's remarks on the Azores and on the importance of both of those issues. And I'll submit for a written question relating to the Turkish, our efforts to ensure that the Turks respect the Christians and are respecting the churches and religious freedom in that country, which I'll follow up with. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to gas prices, I think there is room for considering ways to rein in speculation and gouging. Yes, are there events that are happening in the world that raise questions? Yes, but to the extent that it justifies or can explain the increase in the gas prices, I don't believe so. So therefore, I have long thought that there has to be some market mechanism that can be explored to try to break speculation that is unrelated. Now, if the Iranians close the Strait of Hormuz, that would be a real event, and we'd have to deal with it, and we've said we would deal with it, but that would cause the market to obviously react. But right now, there's talk in the air about all kinds of things, but there is no event. So I do think it's worth exploring the legislation that you referenced. With respect to manufacturing, this administration has brought more trade actions against China, against unfair trade practices, against the theft of intellectual property, against the use of indigenous innovation, and we will continue to do so because we don't fear a level playing field. I have great confidence in the workers and businesses of Rhode Island to be competitive with anybody. But if a big thumb is on the scale, whether it's currency manipulation or indigenous innovation or the unfortunate theft of intellectual property, that makes competition one-sided. And so this administration has taken a very aggressive approach on the defensive side. On the offensive side, I just hosted a big conference at the State Department where we had all the American chambers from around the world come in to talk about how we could do a better job helping American businesses, how we could, really knock down those barriers, cut through that red tape. And so we want to be deeply involved with our 1,000 economic officers around the world in helping to open markets and create jobs here at home. We consider that part of what we call economic statecraft, and I am very committed to it.
Thank you so much. Judge Poe is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have some questions regarding beef trade with Taiwan, U.S. rice given a fair shot in Iraq, and also some questions about Pakistan. And I ask unanimous consent to submit those for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you for being here. I know you have to leave. I want to talk about something that we have always talked about when we discuss things, and it's the folks that live in Camp Ashraf. They are being moved. Some are being moved to Camp Liberty. Camp Liberty now is a situation where there's not enough water. The sewage is a tremendous problem. There's no electricity. People there are not allowed to see their family members. They're not allowed to see lawyers. Some have compared Camp Liberty to a prison. Rudy Giuliani said it's not a prison, it's a concentration camp. So people are not being moved from Camp Ashraf to Camp Liberty. And of course the goal, and it's my goal just like it is, I hope yours, to get those people out of Iraq and get them somewhere in the world where they can be safe and they can be free and they can reunite with their families. We have two situations going on. We have the designation of the FTO is still an issue. It's been going on a long time. I have worked with your department trying to find out on a consistent basis, is there new evidence? Is there more evidence why they should stay on the FTO? Good evidence one way or the other, what it is. I've been to every briefing, Homeland Security, and that your office has sponsored regarding the designation and why they're on it. And I'm not convinced they ought to stay on it. And we continue to wait now, so much so that even, I think yesterday, a lawsuit was filed again to get the State Department to, pick a horse and ride it, as I like to say. Meanwhile, during this time, there have been two situations in Camp Ashraf where people have died. Others have been wounded by, regardless of whose fault that has occurred. And so there's no more people moving to Camp Liberty because of the conditions in Camp Liberty. And to my knowledge, as of today, no one has left Camp Liberty to go somewhere else in the world. And so, as sincere as I can possibly be, I'd like to know from you a couple of things. First, is the United States prepared to take any people from Camp Liberty? Does the FTO designation that they still have affect that in any way? And I'd like to preface that question with one other situation. The last time I was in Iraq, met with Maliki, we asked him if we could go and visit the folks in Camp Ashraf and see for ourselves what it was like. And he said, absolutely not. But the one thing he told all of us, the reason they are in Camp Ashraf is because your country designates them as an FTO organization, and we treat them like a foreign terrorist organization. So he dumped it back on our designation as the reason he was treating them the way he was treating them. He apparently got so irritated with us for even asking the question. We learned when we left his office that we had been evicted from the country. He asked us to leave. Of course, we did what we needed to do, but it's a serious matter. And so earlier you mentioned that the FTO designation is tied to Camp Ashraf, and there being a paramilitary group. They don't have any weapons there. So can you tell us where we are and if we're going to see some resolution about getting this designation removed, getting the people in Camp Liberty humane conditions, and moving the process to countries, including the United States, so these people can leave the area, which everybody wants to do?
Well, Congressman, I appreciate your deep concern. I share it because we are trying to work to resolve a complex situation, avoid bloodshed and violence, and have the people from Camp Ashraf move to the Camp Haria and have them processed as soon as the United Nations can process them. There were a lot of, I would have preferred having them processed at Ashraf. That turned out to be impractical for a lot of reasons, and therefore the move now should open up an accelerated process for these interviews to be held and decisions made. And we're working around the clock. We're seeing improvements in the infrastructure. We have to close Camp Ashraf in order to move this process forward, and it will be a key factor in any decision regarding the foreign terrorist organization status.
Thank you so much. Mr. Connolly, I'm going to ask your forgiveness because according to the procedures that we set forth, even though you've been a good soldier and you've sat here the whole time, Mr. Murphy played it well and came here, and he's next on the queue to ask the question. So it's the last question. You want to share it? Quick one, and then Mr. Connolly, too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Thank you very much for being here with us today, and I will be brief to allow Mr. Connolly to jump in as well before you leave. You've been generous with your time. I am one of a large number of folks here who are skeptical about our current timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm frankly surprised we haven't talked more about Afghanistan here today. And part of that skepticism comes from the fact that I'd like to see us spending a lot more time on the diplomatic and economic cooperation necessary to get Afghanistan to a place in which they can succeed on their own. And so I had a couple questions related to that economic and diplomatic cooperation, but I'll ask one of them, and it's on the economic side. There's various numbers that come out suggesting that 80 to 90 to perhaps even as high as 97% of the Afghan economy is dependent right now on international aid. I'd love to get an update from you as to how you see the timetable playing out over the next 5 years to make sure that as we withdraw our military contingent, that we leave behind a stable economy there, and perhaps suggestions that you have for the United States Congress as to things that we can do here to make sure that we leave behind a stable economy. I'd like to see us pull out as quickly as possible on the military side, but I recognize that we've got to make sure that we don't leave an economy that collapses upon our withdrawal, and I think that is something that we have not talked enough about as a congressman. Would love your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Connolly, if you could ask the question.
Okay. Welcome, Madam Secretary, and let me join my colleagues in expressing my great admiration for your service to your country. You've been an extraordinary Secretary of State, and I've known a lot of Secretaries of State over the last 30 years, so I thank you for your service. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit, and I thank my colleague from Connecticut for his courtesy, on our diplomatic efforts to sort of try to change minds in Russia and China with respect to the Syrian situation. I mean, it gets worse by the day. They have provided a shield of protection that has, at this point, proved not only counterproductive, but frankly lethal. And I'd welcome your thoughts about how we're engaging diplomatically and trying to turn that around. Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your courtesy as well.
Thank you both. Congressman Murphy, we do have some very specific ideas and plans about what we could do to assist Afghanistan being more integrated into the regional economy, developing their own economic assets. I would like to take it for the record to give you a broader set of responses, because we see this, as you just said, as a critical part to really support the transition of our military troops out in the end of 2014. They do go hand in hand, which is one of the reasons that transition period for military withdrawal was established. So we will follow up with you. And Congressman Conley, you know, we are doing everything we can think of to influence the Russians and the Chinese, particularly the Russians. They're the ones with the very deep, long-standing relationship with the Assad family, with Syria. They continue to sell arms to the Syrian regime. So we know that if we can persuade them to work with us at least on the humanitarian issue, they will have access to Assad that hardly anybody else does have, certainly nobody in the West. So it is a very troubling and frustrating situation because the Russians continue to say, oh, they're all for humanitarian aid, but then they don't produce any plan that Assad will sign off on. And perhaps after their upcoming election, they will be able to focus on the serious humanitarian situation that is causing so much loss of life and suffering inside Syria. But we're not waiting. We are trying to work out other ways of getting humanitarian assistance into Syria, and also support efforts on the borders, because people are fleeing. They're coming out in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq, and especially in Turkey. So, you know, we will be there to try to help the people who are coming out as well. This is a terrible crisis that demands the entire world's attention, and I hope that Russia will come and work with us to try to resolve it.
Thank you so much. And Madam Secretary, if I could yield 1 minute to Mr. Johnson, who's been so patiently waiting there, and I don't want to end the meeting without him having an opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real quick question, Madam Secretary, and thank you for being here today. With its growing economy and vast foreign reserves, it would seem that Beijing has more than enough money to deal with many of the issues that U.S. foreign aid supports, like its own citizens' health issues. Borrowing money from the Chinese government to spend back in China on health programs there seems a particularly bad use of U.S. government funds, especially as Americans struggle to cover their own rising health care costs. Why are we proposing $2 million in support of health programs in China when the Chinese hold an estimated $1.2 trillion of U.S. debt?
Well, Congressman, the remaining aid that we are asking for goes to what we consider to be transnational issues in which we have a stake. It was United States aid and leadership that finally helped China respond to their own HIV/AIDS crisis, which does have a positive effect on the epidemic far beyond their borders. When we look at communicable diseases, when we look at you know, the need to try to help democracy, human rights, good governance groups. There are a lot of brave lawyers in cities in China that are, you know, standing up against coercive practices. So I think I will take it for the record and give you a breakdown of the kinds of things we've been doing, but I share your general point that you know, we're certainly not looking to support the development of China's economy. They're doing that well enough on their own, but there are certain key values that we still believe we can further within a trade and within an aid relationship with China.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, and thank you to Mr. Duncan, Mr. Bilirakis, and Mr. Wilson. You're on my dance card, and you'll come up first next time. Madam Secretary, before we adjourn, I'd like to note that since you have announced publicly that you do not intend to serve beyond the end of this term, this is your final appearance to testify on the budget before our committee. I'd like to thank you again so deeply for making yourself available to answer our questions today and during the past 3 years. And I hope that we have the opportunity to host you again for other testimony prior to the conclusion of your exemplary service. I thank you, mi amiga. The meeting is adjourned.